I am going to cut this cherry coffee table into 737 pieces to create this vase. But is destroying furniture to create a segmented vase even worth the hassle? I'll get to that later. First, the destruction has to happen, which starts by removing all the metal parts. Then follows the careful deconstruction of the drawers. And, as you can see, I'm off to a great start, splitting the very second piece of cherry I tried to liberate. While I remove all the nails, I'll tell you about the design. I've chosen to go for a very hexagonal pattern. The cream-colored parts are made from the coffee table. The dark borders are walnut, the red is paduk, and the brown is mahogany. The vase itself consists of 42 rings, and each ring will have 45 segments, for a grand total of 1,890 segments, of which 737 will be made from this coffee table. To ease your mind, I'm not destroying a piece of priceless antique furniture here. This coffee table was actually mass-produced in 2004, as you might be able to tell from the mark here. Now this is the whole. One large tabletop, a bunch of smaller boards, and some other parts and bits. But I'm not going to use those, because they're not made out of cherry wood. And these are mahogany scraps, which I got from a Dutch shuffleboard I destroyed a while back. And don't worry, these walnut and paduk scraps were actual firewood I bought from my exotic wood supplier, so no furniture was harmed to obtain those. The next step might very well be the most important thing to do when reusing tables as lumber. And that's to remove the glue seams from your boards. This has two main reasons. The first is structural integrity. I don't trust glue seams I didn't glue myself, especially if they've been made a very long time ago. Because the wood glues on the market right now are just a whole lot stronger than anything for sale in the past. The second reason might be my perfectionism speaking, but I just think it looks bad if there's a glue seam somewhere it doesn't belong. Take a look at this little jar I made a year ago. I quite like the design, but when you examine it closely, you can see the glue seam between the pieces of oak. While it's only visible on close examination, it's still a flaw. And on a vase I want to sell for around €2,000, only perfection is acceptable. With all my lumber resawn into usable pieces, I now have to rip all my boards to the correct width, which is 2.7 centimeters for the first ring. And after I've cut, I always double check the measurements before continuing. This is about 2 millimeters too large, but that's not a problem. As long as it's oversized, I can easily turn that extra width away. Now that all the pieces for the first ring are the correct width, I need to cut them to the correct thickness. But to do so, I need to flip the table saw fence. The final ring should have a thickness of around 5 millimeters. But if I were to cut all the pieces to that thickness now, the vase will look like someone left it in a hydraulic press. Because to achieve perfect glue seams, I need to sand the rings flat later on. So I cut them to around 8 millimeters thick right now to account for a few lost millimeters in thickness during sanding. This is a table saw sled, with a 3D printed template to ensure both of the fences will have the correct angle. When adjusting, it is also important to have both of the fences symmetrical, which, as you might expect, will deliver the cleanest possible glue seams. And that's basically what all this cutting is about. The highest level of precision I can manage to create the cleanest possible glue seams later on. This is a scrap piece of cherry, which I'll be using to cut a segment. Then measure that segment, then compare it to the value it's supposed to be, and then move the table saw fence a tiny bit, and then repeat. Cut, measure, compare, adjust. Cut, measure, compare, adjust. Cut, measure, compare, and hey, this one is actually close enough. And from there I had to cut the real pieces, which was basically the same as the last step, only now I didn't have to measure or compare. Just cut. And when I had the required number of paduk pieces, mark it off and then continue with the next wood species. This was the most boring part of the entire build, just the same moves over and over and over. But I had to stay concentrated, because losing focus when standing behind the table saw is a great way to lose some fingers. When the 45 segments for ring 1 were finally done, it was only that exact same process for the other rings, 41 more times. Two full days of cutting later, I had finally all the 1,890 pieces I needed to continue to the next step, which was sanding all 1,890 pieces. Yay! At least with sanding, I could afford to be distracted. So I started listening to the audiobook version of Animal Farm from George Orwell. But because of my 2x speed listening habits, I managed to finish it before I was even halfway done sanding. So then it was on to the next audiobook. And from there, during the rest of the build, I managed to complete the following list of audiobooks: Cat's Cradle, The Great Gatsby, To Kill a Mockingbird, Frankenstein, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Wolfhall, and A Game of Thrones. So I guess that might give you an indication of how long building this vase actually took. When I was done sanding, all the segments had to go back into their paper cups, after which I taped them shut. Because during the sanding portion, I also counted and made sure each ring had the exact right number of segments. Taping them shut ensures that I don't lose any, because missing a segment during the glue up can be rather stressful. I happen to know that one from experience. During the glue up of ring 27, I managed to misplace a segment because it was stuck to the tape, which I didn't notice. So, with all the glue already slathered on, I suddenly had to frantically look around and crawl all over the floor looking for it, until I finally found it in the trash. And no, I don't have footage of that. Would you look at that? While I was talking, the ring has already assembled itself. Gluing is a rather straightforward task. At least, when you have all the segments. Use a little brush, slather the glue on, put it in place, and on to the next segment. And when everything was glued, I used some gentle persuasion with a mallet to flatten the entire construction, then put the rubber band around it and checked if all the segments were aligned properly. From there, it was checking for roundness, and then on to the next ring. The vase here looks rather elongated because all the rings are way too thick. The vinyl vase will look a bit more like this, squished down. More sanding. Yay. Here I have to make sure that all the residual glue is sanded away and that the ring is completely flat. And while this process is a lot quicker than the previous sanding step, it is also a lot more dangerous. These rings are only 8 mm thick and I have to hold them. So my hands are getting really close to the spinning sandpaper, which means that sometimes I'm sanding my hands rather than the ring, which is a rather unpleasant experience. And, as you can see from the plasters, this happened quite a few times. I really have to find a better way, but for this vase, I decided to just power through and accept the minor injuries. This little piece of walnut is going to be the bottom of the vase. So after finding the center, drilling a mortise with a Forstner and mounting the piece on the lathe, I could finally start turning. And the first step is, as always, make square thing round. And when it is round, mark out the mortise for the vase and turn it to perfect dimensions for my chuck. The survival of the entire vase depends on this mortise. A mortise is basically a hole into which the chuck clamps to hold the entire vase in place. And the better the chuck fits the mortise, the stronger it'll hold the vase. As you might be able to hear, this scraper didn't really cut smoothly enough, so I quickly switched to my ball gouge to rough out most of the mortise. And with that done, I used a tiny skew chisel to refine the edges until they were approaching perfection. After that, it was time to turn the rest of the bottom. I used the scraper here to get the best possible surface finish, so I have less sanding to do. Because like every sane woodworker, I hate sanding. And as you can see from the fine shavings I'm creating, this scraper is already leaving a great surface. When I was happy with that, it was on to checking for a slightly concave surface. That's important, because as you can see from these high quality drawings, when something has a flat bottom surface, 100% of that surface touches the table. But if it's even slightly concave, you reduce that percentage by a lot. So let's assume the red dot is a piece of sand. Now, if you put your flat bottomed surface onto a table, it will wobble. But if you have a concave bottom, it'll sit perfectly flat most of the time. You still have a problem if the grain of sand is under the rim, so I can't guarantee 100% wobble reduction. For that you would need a vase with 3 legs. But for example, 95% reduction is already a great improvement. Now, with all of that out of the way, I made a last high-speed finishing pass with my freshly sharpened scraper, and then it was on to sanding. And with the bottom fully finished, I turned it around and sanded the top face flat. Please note the enormous cloud of dust. Sanding this much material away is a messy process. So if any of you do this yourself, please make sure you have proper dust protection. I am carefully checking for flatness, and when I'm convinced it's good enough, I use a leaf blower to clear most of the dust from the wood grain. An air compressor would be ideal, but I don't have one. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean, but too much dust can start to impede on the structural integrity of the glue. To glue the rings, I'm actually using a quick-setting wood glue. That means it reaches full structural integrity after around 15 minutes. And when you have 42 individual glue-ups, that really speeds up the process. The only downside is that it isn't waterproof. So just a friendly reminder, do not put water in your wood vase. Then I quickly had to align the ring to the base before the glue started to set in. I'm using the tailstock as a clamping force, but it kept sliding, so I decided to use a mallet to hammer it into place. Most of you are probably already screaming at your screens right now, but it took me around 30 more rings before I noticed why this was a bad idea. And you might think me stupid, but it worked, and why change a working formula? 15 minutes later. When the glue was fully dry, I removed my backer board functioning as a clamp and could begin to turn. Now the stop face has to be dead flat again. So I turned it close to flat while also making sure I didn't remove too much with too little material, to end up at my desired ring thickness of around 5 mm. Then I had to also round out the outside edge, because I will be using that to align the next ring. So if it's even slightly off center, I risk compounding errors. Now all of this rounding has to be done very carefully, because if I remove too much wood, it makes turning the final shape and keeping an acceptable wall thickness a lot harder. Then followed some more flattening, this time with a scraper. From there, to ensure everything is perfectly flat, I mark the inside and outside edge, and when both pencil rings are sanded away, I will know for sure they're good enough. Here I'm still using a piece of wood with some sandpaper wrapped around it, but later on I start using my sanding disc, because that one delivers better results. Then one last check for perfect flatness and it's onto the leaf blower to remove the dust. After which followed some more gluing, malleting and aligning before the second ring is securely attached. And from there, it was basically the same process for all the other rings. Make flat, glue, align, wait 15 minutes, next ring. All until it was time to turn the first part of the inside of the vase. I have to do this now, because later, with more rings glued on, it will be a lot harder to reach this far into the vase. So doing it now saves future me a lot of hassle. This was actually quite simple. Rough out with the ball gouge, then finish turn with the scraper, until the inside was one continuous curve. Then some more sanding and finishing, and it's time to glue on the next ring. And then repeat this gluing process a few times, but now with some turning in between. This is a steady rest, and for most turners this is probably quite the basic tool. It is used to provide support to the outside of a vase, so it has less chance at flying off the lathe. But for me, this is the first ever time I use it. I made this steady rest specifically for this build, and I've never tested it before. I saw the need for one after the last segmented vase I made came flying off the lathe. Could I just take a moment to introduce you to my arch enemy? Just before I could test my steady rest, some rain clouds swooped in and I had to very quickly move my entire operation inside. And a few minutes later, it was pouring. So while I wait for this rain to clear, let me explain the economics of destroying a coffee table. This is a 3D model of the coffee table I destroyed in the beginning, or at least the cherry parts of it. And as Onshape has so very nicely calculated for me, it has a volume of around 29,500 cubic centimeters, which is around 29.5 liters. Now, for the same money I paid for this coffee table, I could have only bought 20 liters of cherry lumber. And for any Americans who really don't understand the concept of a liter, a bald eagle has a volume of about 6.4 liters. Which means that my coffee table has around 4.6 bald eagles worth of wood, where with store-bought lumber I could have only gotten 3.1 bald eagles worth of wood. Wow, it seems like my explanation took so long, it's already the next day. I can finally see if my steady rest actually functions. I know it might not look like much, but for me, this was quite a tense moment. If anything goes wrong here, I'd lose around 40 hours of work, and I've never used a steady rest before. So from there, I could continue gluing and turning the vase until the entire underside was finished. And then it was time to take it all off the lathe and marvel at it one last time before the top gets glued on. Because when that happens, no one will ever properly see the inside of this vase again. With half of the vase finished, I decided to look into why my tailstock kept slipping, which quickly became apparent. All that hammering had just completely stripped the bolt. Luckily, the bolt was long enough so I could fix it with just a few washers, making sure the nut had some real threads to clamp onto again. With that at rest, I could remove the steady rest and start working on the top of the vase. To hold the top on the lathe, I used a sacrificial glue block, so this beautiful little block of oak will be 98% sawdust before the video is finished. I quickly turned it into the desired shape, which was round. Then I decided to turn away some of its thickness, so I had less wood to turn away when it came to finalizing the entire vase. But this was the biggest mistake I made in this entire video, and I will only realize it at the worst possible moment. When the sacrificial block was nice and flat, I could continue with gluing on more rings, but I won't bore you with those details. With the top also finished, I could finally glue both halves into one single vase. When both halves are glued together, I have no way to clean up the squeeze out from the inside of the vase. So I was very careful to apply a thin layer and keep away from the inside rim. With the glue all on, it finally went wrong. I wanted to use the mortise in the sacrificial glue block to align the top to the bottom, so it would be perfectly centered. And that seemed to work, right until I went to tighten up the tailstock. Those cracks you hear is the sacrificial glue block breaking. I had turned it too thin, so with the glue all on, I was now unable to provide clamping pressure. Quickly scrambling for a solution, I grabbed my sanding disc and used it to exert the clamping pressure on the rim. But because of the grippy nature of sandpaper, I didn't succeed in aligning the top to the bottom perfectly in the short time I had left before the glue set up. And, thinking back on it, it was probably better if I had completely removed both halves, cleaned up the glue and tried again. But glue-ups are high-stress situations, and sadly, when the idea finally entered my mind, both halves had already been glued together for over 12 hours. The next day it was time for damage control. How badly did I mess this up? It all starts with turning the lathe on, for which I need the steady rest. So after some careful adjustment, I worked up the nerve to finally turn the lathe on. There were more vibrations than I would have liked, but I decided there wasn't anything I could do to make this safer, so I made the executive decision to just continue. The first step was turning the sacrificial oak piece into shavings. While making these cuts, I took care to apply all pressure towards the base of the vase and the chuck, because if I apply my cutting force that way, the least possible pressure is exerted onto the steady rest. The camera didn't really capture it, but the steady rest was rocking back and forth. So in the future, I either need to add some more wood to the back of it to make it more rigid, or create a second anchor point at the top to hold the steady rest in place from two sides. You might have wondered why I only said 98% of the sacrificial piece of oak got turned into shavings. Well, this little disc in the center remained somewhat whole, and I reckoned it should be around 2% of the total volume of this little block. When all the oak and the glue residue was turned away, I had to return the inside opening of the vase. Now, while this wasn't absolutely necessary, the whole top is slightly off-center. So if I left it as is and then turned the outside edge of that opening around to the new axis of rotation, the rim would be an inconsistent thickness, where one side would be slightly thicker than the other. In this shot you can perfectly see the off-centerness. My chisel is engaging a lot deeper on one side than the other. With the inside turned through again, I could move on to a finishing pass on the rim, and then it was time for sanding and finishing. I then had to remove the vase from the lathe, to make a piece of wood to put into the opening of the vase so the tailstock has something to push against. And this was really stupid on my part. If I had made this jam piece a few steps earlier, I could have left the vase on the chuck. For those unfamiliar with wood turning, if you remove an item from the lathe, you're almost never going to get it back in the exact same position. Which means this also introduced a slight wobble. With a piece of cloth to protect the finish, I then pushed in the jam piece and clamped the tailstock shut. Before I start turning the vase itself, I have to remove the cloth. It was just flapping around wildly, and if my hands got close, they'd get whipped. With a maximally sharpened chisel, this went surprisingly well. I had never expected you could get this clean of a cut on fabric. As you will see when I remove the vase from the lathe, I've basically cut a perfect little circle from the fabric. Then it became a matter of scraping away all the high spots in the rings until I am left with my vase shape. The skill here is in stopping the moment you have a smooth surface, because with the inside already made, making the walls too thin can happen before you even notice. Now in the end, the wall thickness at the top of the vase is a bit thinner than I would have liked. But I believe that's because I glued it off center, not because I made a mistake turning. It's not a structural problem anyhow, just a minor flaw no one but me will ever notice. Sharp scrapers also make it a whole lot easier to turn with control. I made sure to sharpen my scrapers every 2 or 3 cuts. And for those wondering, my scrapers are all repurposed old chisels or files, and they lose their edge easily. But the quality of the tool doesn't matter, as long as you keep them sharp. And for me, that meant walking back and forth to the grindstone a lot. The only bit of creative liberty I had left when turning the vase was in how I shaped the foot, because the walnut piece I had used was slightly oversized to give me some room to finalize the curve into the vase itself. And that's the biggest problem I have with segmented turning. You front-load all the creative decisions and then have to do the work, in the highest risk environment. If I make a mistake here, all the work getting to this point would be for nothing. And I can't even make my own choices. It's like a really tense game of connect the dots. I wanted to take this time where I'm sanding and finishing to talk a bit about money. On the one hand, I want to sell this vase. But on the other hand, if I sell this vase, I also want an acceptable hourly wage for it. And with wood turning, it is hard to meet both of those criteria at once. Because projects might take as long as a fine furniture build, sometimes require much the same tools, but in physical size, they just end up a lot smaller. Which I feel like makes it harder to ask a high price for them. I believe 40 euros an hour is totally reasonable for a woodworker in my part of the world. And I spent 64 hours making this vase, so then I'd have to sell it for around 2,500 euros. Now I don't see anyone buying this vase for that price. If I account for filming and general inefficiencies, I can justify lowering the price to around 2,000 euros. But if I lower it even further, in the same neighborhood as some of the things I see floating around on Etsy, it just feels like I'm stealing from myself. which makes it just not worth it to sell. I am woodturning as a hobby, and for me that means the only pressure to sell anything is shelf space. So with this vase priced at 2,000 euros, it has just become very clear to me that trying to save money on materials is folly. I suspect that overall I have used around 100 euros worth of wood and consumables in the creation of this vase, and if I had bought lumber from a wood supplier, that might have increased to 150 euros. So in context, when woodturning such a complicated project as this one, material price is almost irrelevant. Which makes me think, no, it wasn't worth it destroying that coffee table, but that's also a valuable lesson to learn. Now, with all of that said, if you believe 2,000 euros is a fair price and you want to buy this vase, send me a message and we can work something out. Okay, enough talking. Let's take a look at the final result.